because in the course of writing them, I came to no longer make a distinction that I had in the past between, poetry people and civilians. So here goes. Wonder, a Syzygy. The talk is in 3 parts. It's about 45 minutes long. You can all hear me? Okay. 1. The world whirls. It's probably not the most promising beginning to this talk for me to observe that my subject, like silence, has a way of disappearing the moment you speak of it. Love, anger, regret, even boredom, wonder's antipodes, may entrench themselves in us more deeply over time. But wonder, I'd venture, is always a fugitive affair. Maybe it's a matter of developmental psychology. Already in the middle of life, I find myself becoming a nostalgist of childhood wonder. These days, I feel it mostly in my dreams. Or maybe it's civilization itself that's outgrown its wonder years. We start out with the marvels of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, only to arrive, in our disenchanted era, at wonder bread. Any way you slice it, wonder is ever vanishing. Still, I suspect the occasional sighting of this endangered affect has something to do with why a middle-aged writer like me, I don't know why I keep calling myself middle-aged, but at the time it seemed to be the case, like me, continues to write poems in the twilight of the Anthropocene. Of course, William Wordsworth said all of this more eloquently and in pentameter verse, too. Maybe poetry is a trace of wonder in linguistic form, is a trace of lost wonder in linguistic form. By following that trace for the next hour, I hope we'll come a bit closer to wonder itself. Let's begin with an early wonder of the Western literary tradition. In Book 18 of the Iliad, the god Hephaestus forges a shield for Achilles, who's lost his armor in the bloody fog of war. But as Hephaestus works the shield's surface, this peculiar blacksmith, being a god after all, simply can't resist creating a world, too. There he made the earth, and there the sky and the sea, and the inexhaustible blazing sun, and the moon rounding full, and there the constellations, all that crown the heavens. A little creation myth blossoms amid the slaughter, as Hephaestus hammers not only the earth, but within the brief passage of 3 dactylic hexameters, the totality of the known cosmos onto the shield as well. And he's only just getting warmed up, really. Over the next 150 lines of the poem, which you have in the Robert Fagel's translation, Hephaestus emblazons the shield's surface with a compact survey of ancient civilization, including the arts of war, law, agriculture, animal husbandry, astronomy, music, dance, and so on. A sensualist at heart, he sets this panorama buzzing all over with Epicurean minutiae. We see bunches of lustrous grapes in gold, ripening deep purple. We hear a boy plucking his lyre, so clear it could break the heart with longing. We even taste the savor of a cup of honeyed mellow wine. Not bad for a piece of antiquated military equipment. Faced with such artistry, I can't help thinking of the shield's disabled maker as a kind of poet, like the blind Homer himself. Isn't every poet a crippled little god after all? Sure enough, Hephaestus incorporates a miniature epic into the shield's pageantry too, with its own besieged city, fraught war councils, interfering gods, and loved ones watching anxiously from the ramparts as a tiny surrogate Hector is hauled through the slaughter by his heels. No wonder Homer describes the shield as a world of gorgeous, immortal work. It contains an entire Iliad and more within its gilt compass. Beguiled by Homer's art, some readers have even tried to reverse engineer real shields from this literary blueprint over the millennia. Probably the most spectacular example of all time was fabricated for display at George IV's coronation banquet by the sculptor, draftsman, and Homer enthusiast John Flaxman in 1821. It's a marvel of 19th century British punctiliousness in low relief. Here we find bunches of lustrous grapes in gold, a boy with his lyre, and that cup of honeyed, mellow wine, all meticulously accounted for. And yet I can't help feeling this luminous artifact offers, at best, only a low-resolution copy of the Homeric original. Let's zoom in for a moment on those golden hounds at their master's feet to have a closer look. It took me like 3 hours to figure out how to do that. I'm not sure why Homer enumerates the figures in this tableau with such exactitude amid all the shield's masses. And this is a quote from Homer. And the golden drovers kept the herd in line, 4 in all, with 9 dogs at their heels. But it offers us a perfect opportunity to check Flaxman's work for quality control. 4 drovers? Check. Now let's count the dogs. There should be 9. You might think I'm being persnickety here, and with good reason, but bear with me just a little longer. So, where is that 9th hound? Marianne Moore once famously claimed that omissions are not accidents. It's hard to say whether Flaxman's Missing Hound is an omission or an accident, but it makes me wonder. Listen carefully, and you'll hear the poor beast barking, cringing away, somewhere in the vaporous limbo between fiction and reality. Paws flickering. It's a creaturely cipher for what's lost when we translate the virtual into the real. The former U.S. Army cryptographer and Homer enthusiast, Cy Twombly, illustrates this splendidly in oil, crayon, and graphite in his postmodern Shield of Achilles, a century and a half later. You won't find our Missing Hound here either. And that's precisely the point of Twombly's abstraction. All those kinetic scribbles convey Homer's energia, or literary energy, but they also make an absolute hash of the shield's pictorial imagery. Not even a cryptographer can code so much world into so small a space. Whether you reconstruct it, like Flaxman, or deconstruct it, like Twombly, the Shield of Achilles will forever remain an impossible object. It belongs to that wondrous category of things that are larger inside than outside, like a poem, or a person, or a world. The world is not the mere collection of the countable or uncountable, familiar and unfamiliar things that are at hand, writes Martin Heidegger in The Origin of the Work of Art. But neither is it merely an imagined framework added by a representation to the sum of such given things. The world worlds. End quote. Homer's shield isn't a picture of all the countable or uncountable things, star systems, ripening grape clusters, flickering hounds, that populate the world. As Flaxman and Twombly discovered, it can't even be pictured at all. But it whirls. Quote, All the many men who see it will wonder, Palmesetai, at the sight, Hephaestus predicts, as he hammers the glowing cosmos on his forge. If you were to survey the reader's responses to this literary marvel over the millennia, from the anonymous commentators of antiquity to moderns like Alexander Pope and G.E. Lessing, to undergraduate term papers in Hume 101, you'd end up with something like a brief history of wonder in Western civilization. Describing the plowman at work on the shield's figured surface, another detail, Homer himself is the first among mortals to express wonder at its construction. And the earth churned black behind them, the plowman, like earth churning, solid gold as it was. That was the wonder of Hephaestus's work. I can't imagine a more gorgeous description of humanity's passage through the dark field of world. The earth churned black behind them, like earth churning. But why doesn't Homer say the shield's golden surface churned like earth churning? This Mobius strip of a simile is a wonder in its own right. Spellbound by Hephaestus's artistry, we forget that the shield is a shield in the first place. So we feel like we're watching soil behave like itself. It's a kind of reverse alchemy, where gold becomes dirt, vehicle becomes tenor, and shield becomes world. Sometimes it seems there's no escaping wonder before such worlding work. Of the golden women depicted in the shield's wedding procession, Homer writes, "Each stood moved with wonder." I'm not sure whether we should envy or pity these embossed figures, forever frozen in transport at the wonder they inhabit. But here's the thing. Though Hephaestus prophesies that all the many men who see it will wonder at the sight, none of the many men in the Iliad, Trojan or Greek, ever marvel at the shield's construction. Achilles' fellow soldiers won't even look at the god's radiant work. None dared to look straight at the glare. Each fighter shrank away. Only a blind genius could invent such tragic optics. Homer embeds a gilded cosmos in the midst of his epic, for readers to marvel at through the ages. But the Iliad's inhabitants remain forever blind to this wonder hidden in plain view. Beholding his gift from the gods, even Achilles, the only mortal who scrutinizes the shield's figured surface, fails to wonder at the sight. The more he gazed, the deeper his anger went, his eyes flashing under his eyelids, fierce as fire, exulting, holding the god's shining gifts in his hands. Rage, manus, is the first word of the Iliad, and we usually associate it with blindness rather than perception. I was blinded, lost in my inhuman rage, says Agamemnon during one of his many changes of heart in the poem. But Homer envisions something like a phenomenology of rage in this scene. The more he gazed, the deeper his anger went. For Achilles, anger is more than affect. It's an adjunct of perception itself. Only once he's, quote, thrilled his heart with looking hard at the armor's well-wrought beauty, end quote, does he break off his furious gaze. Far from blinding him, rage furnishes this exceptional character with a singular perspective on things. You can tell I'm thinking about war here and wonder. Why does Achilles alone rage at this world of gorgeous, immortal work? Maybe it has something to do with his sense of vocation. In Book 9 of the Iliad, we find him in his tent, plucking strong and clear on the fine lyre that he won in battle long ago. quote, singing the famous deeds of fighting heroes. I can't help feeling this armchair bard would have made a passable poet in a different world. Isn't every poet a sulky egotist with a hyperactive death drive, after all? But Achilles is born to fight, not to sing. Anything that comes between him and his bloody vocation, including the beautifully carved lyre, its bridge set firm, must be cast aside for him to follow his calling. Not even life itself matters more to him than this grim occupation. Hard on the heels of Hector's death, your death must come at once, his mother warns him. But Achilles only retorts, then let me die at once. What's the point of living if you can no longer kill? Achilles doesn't work to live, he lives to work. Homer uses the word ergon, which means something like labor, to describe the hero's exertions on the battlefield. And his business is death. Wonder, for the Greeks, led to a very different sort of vocation. We see this illustrated in a scene from Plato's Theaetetus, where Socrates plays his customary role of career counselor to a youth who he's interrogated to the point of utter perplexity. Theaetetus. By the gods, Socrates, I am lost in wonder when I think of all these things. I always feel like I should perform this. And sometimes, when I regard them, it really makes my head swim. Socrates. It seems that Theodorus was not far from the truth when he guessed what kind of person you are. For this is an experience which is characteristic of a philosopher. This wondering, Talmazan. This is where philosophy begins, and nowhere else. Funny how Theaetetus must first become lost in wonder in order to find himself. He learns what kind of person he is, a philosopher, from his brush with Talmazan. This beats any aptitude test I took in high school. For Plato, wonder is where philosophy begins and nowhere else. No wonder, no philosophers. Even Aristotle, who built a whole philosophical system from his lover's quarrel with Plato, agrees on this point. It is through, and I'm quoting from Aristotle now, it is through wonder that men now begin and originally began to philosophize, he observes in the Metaphysics. Wondering in the first place at obvious perplexities, and then, by gradual progression, raising questions about the greater matters too, e.g., about the changes of the moon and of the sun, about the stars, and about the origin of the universe. If this sounds familiar, it's because we've come full circle to the origin of the cosmos. The earth, the stars, the inexhaustible blazing sun, and the moon rounding full that Hephaestus hammered onto the shield's bright circumference in the first place. But we've yet to consider those greater matters that form the astronomical rungs on Aristotle's ladder of Talmazan: the moon, the sun, the stars, and the origin of the universe. So let's take the next step in wonder's philosophical progression and look to the moon. Two, worlds beyond. Sooner or later, the moon pops up on pretty much every poet's literary horizon. Whether you're a Japanese courtesan, a Yoruban folk singer, or a postmodernist cosmonaut, it's as close as the art comes to a timeless, universal motif. But how many poets ever make the moon new? Nearly 350 years ago, John Milton managed to work a nifty little lunar renovation into the epic paraphernalia of Paradise Lost, as the irrepressible Satan, after 9 days and nights in free fall from the battlefield of heaven, takes up arms once again. And you have this passage in your handout. His ponderous shield, ethereal temper, massy, large, and round, behind him cast. The broad circumference hung on his shoulders like the moon, whose orb through optic glass the Tuscan artist views at evening from the top of Fiesole, or in Valdarno, to descry new lands, rivers, or mountains in her spotty globe. Even the most pious poet can't resist a bit of literary vandalism now and then. Emblazoning the full moon on Satan's shield, Milton blots out the classical world of Achilles' shield, just as Paradise Lost will, he hopes, eclipse the Iliad in the annals of literary history someday. We'll come back to eclipses a little later in this talk. Massy, yet also ethereal in temper, this literary shield is another impossible object. It belongs to that wondrous category of things that hold dual citizenship in the realms of the material and the ideal, like a poem, or an angel, or the venerable moon itself. Since antiquity, astronomers had speculated about the moon's ontology. Was it composed of ethereal vapors, or massy, like the Earth? Until Milton's Tuscan artist put these theories to the proof with the aid of his optic glass. Oddly, we don't really see much of the moon on Satan's shield. Superimposed on its spotty globe, we find a portrait of Galileo Galilei, the man in Milton's Moon, who, more than any poet or rebel angel, revolutionized our view of the heavens above. Milton visited Galileo, by then old, blind, and under house arrest, in Florence during the summer of 1638. DreamWorks has been sitting on my script of this story for ages. In his book, The Starry Messenger, Galileo had published the first topographical drawings of the moon's surface to appear in the West nearly 3 decades earlier. That's actually sideways. The big crater should be on the bottom. Gonna have to fire my graduate assistant. Peering through his telescope, the Florentine astronomer marveled at a cratered and mountainous terrain that defied expectation. The surface of the moon is not even, smooth, and perfectly spherical, as the majority of philosophers have conjectured that it and the other celestial bodies are, but, on the contrary, rough and uneven, and covered with cavities and protuberances, just like the face of the earth, which is rendered diverse by lofty mountains and deep valleys. Galileo discovered that the moon, too, was a world, just like ours. Look closely at that progression of topological nouns ending Milton's lines in that passage I've given you, and you'll see how the moon came of age as a world in this period. From a flat circumference to a volumetric orb to a mapmaker's globe. In Galileo's wake, the French engraver Claude Mellin's moon maps would soon highlight the chiaroscuro curvature of the lunar orb. By the end of the 18th century, the moon had assumed world-like dimensions in the British artist John Russell's aureate globe. All this time, the Earth was yielding its last blank spots, known as sleeping beauties, to geography. But now, another spotty globe offered new lands, rivers, or mountains to be mapped. And the moon was only the beginning. The moon on Satan's shield heralds a revolution in the history of cosmological wonder. Galileo's telescope revealed a host of worlds in the heavens above, new moons circling Jupiter, stars never seen before by the human eye, all swiftly incorporated into blind Milton's literary vision of the cosmos. Paradise Lost stages a mask of wonder beneath this canopy of plural worlds. Awestruck, Adam delivers a Hamletic soliloquy on outer space, which makes of this earth a spot, a grain, an atom, with the firmament compared, and all her numbered stars that seem to roll spaces incomprehensible. Milton himself wonders if God might ordain his dark materials to create more worlds from chaos someday. Satan, too, plays the amateur cosmologist, speculating that space may produce other worlds for his legions to invade following their expulsion from the kingdom of heaven. If you find Paradise Lost slow going, try reading it as science fiction. Spielberg, what are you waiting for? Nebulous monsters wing their way through star systems. Angels and demons alike imagine humans colonizing other planets. For the first time in English poetry that I know of, we view the earth from outer space, that globe whose hither side with light from hence, though but reflected, shines, half cloaked in brightness, half in shadow. I could go on. But amid all this, the archangel Raphael warns Adam, and by extension, Star Trek aficionados to come, to dream not of other worlds, what creatures there live, in what state, condition, or degree. Wonder, like the moon, has a dark side. Let's not forget that the most wonderstruck character in Paradise Lost also happens to be the most fiendish by far. Unlike furious Achilles, Satan simply can't stop mooning over creation. From the stairway to heaven, he looks down with wonder at the earth below. Once he's touched down on our planet, he gazes upon Eden with new wonder. When he first sees Adam and Eve, he's overcome by wonder and could love them too. Such vulnerability to wonder is frankly endearing. I, for one, can't help feeling sympathy for the poor devil when we last see him, at the conclusion of his final speech to the rebel angels in hell, still wondering to the bitter end. He stood, expecting the demons' universal shout and high applause to fill his ear, when, contrary, he hears on all sides, from innumerable tongues, a dismal, universal hiss, the sound of public scorn. He wondered, but not long had leisure, wondering at himself now more. His visage drawn, he felt, to sharp and spare. His arms clung to his ribs, his legs entwining each other, till supplanted, down he fell, a monstrous serpent on his belly prone. I felt this way myself after poetry readings sometimes. Isn't every poet an unruly angel trapped in a reptile's body, after all? The last thing Satan wonders at in Paradise Lost isn't a newly discovered planet or humankind, but himself transformed into a serpent. You'd expect him to feel horror at this grotesque Ovidian metamorphosis, his cranium warping hideously, his arms fusing into his torso, his legs corkscrewing into a scaly tail. But Satan's wondrous journey through the cosmos ends where it began, in a failure to see himself for what he really is. Maybe dreaming too much of worlds beyond reach can make a monster of you. Worlds swim through Paradise Lost like bubbles in a glass of champagne. But Milton cautions us not to lose sight of ourselves in this teeming universe. Who's more blind to this world of ours than the astronomer squinting into his telescope's eyepiece. They can foresee a future eclipse of the sun, writes Augustine in his Confessions, but they do not perceive their own eclipse in the present. I suspect Milton had this sort of inner eclipse in mind when he described Satan's dusky radiance following the archangel's fall from heaven. His form had not yet lost all her original brightness, nor appeared less than archangel ruined, and the excess of glory obscured. As when the sun new risen looks through the horizontal misty air shorn of his beams, or from behind the moon in dim eclipse, disastrous twilight sheds on half the nations, and with fear of change perplexes monarchs. Darkened so, yet shone above them all, the archangel. Milton's selenographic shield proudly advertises Galileo's discoveries, but its spotty globe also reminds us that Lucifer, the erstwhile bringer of light, is, in truth, eclipse personified. Darkened so, yet shone above them all, the archangel. Nothing discloses the dark side of wonder like an eclipse. I saw one once, through a piece of welder's glass, in a derelict park on the other side of the world. Even the crows seemed perplexed by its disastrous twilight. There was an uncanny chill, as if a refrigerator door had swung open inside me. But the wonder of it all wasn't that the sun had been blotted out overhead. What stopped my breath was the slow silhouette of another world gliding into view. 3. Worlds within. 3 centuries after Paradise Lost first lit up the Western literary firmament, the American poet, cookbook author, and marijuana enthusiast Ronald Johnson purchased an 1897 edition of Milton's poem in a Seattle bookshop, and promptly began to black out most of the text from its pages. Why would anyone so meticulously deface an already outdated 1837 copy of the venerable Puritan epic? I thought it would be funny, Johnson later explained, like a sheepish delinquent caught spray painting a cathedral. But I decided you don't tamper with Milton to be funny. You have to be serious. End quote. What began as a little joke at Milton's expense developed into a postmodernist masterpiece of literary eclipse in its own right. Blot out the first and last 2 letters of Paradise, and you have Reddy. Lose the first and last letters of Lost, and you have O's. Even the title of the poem Johnson fashioned from this procedure, Radios, is ordained solely from Milton's dark materials. Before publishing this literary curio, Johnson scrupulously whitewashed the epic he'd defaced, yielding a photographic negative of his poetic eclipse. That's what the first page of Radios looks like when published. Nobody wrote Radios. The poem was wondrously erased into existence. Its author's words are nowhere to be found in this work, and yet, like Milton's creator, he's everywhere. There is another world, the French poet Paul Eluard once said, but it is inside this one. I think Johnson would gently amend this to say there are other worlds, but they are inside this one. Turning the astronomical theater of Paradise Lost inside out, Johnson investigates the plurality of worlds within. Worlds that both in him and all things drive deepest. A little textual puzzle from Ark, the cosmological epic Johnson labored over for 20 years, illustrates the wondrous multiplication of inner worlds throughout this poet's work. The literary critic Stephen Burt deciphers the secret messages embedded in this concrete poem. Earth, earth, earth. Ear, the art hearth. Hear the art. Hear the art. Sampling a Jeremiad from the King James Bible, O earth, 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 hear the word of the Lord, Johnson composes a manifold matrix of worlds. It's one thing to register the verse in universe, and another entirely to construct a poetics of the multiverse. And I really do think Johnson pulls it off here. The erasurious decision not to delete the S that pluralizes his book's title makes worlds of this difference. Radios isn't a radio. It's an orchestra of radios. That's not quite right either. See that caesura fracturing the poem's title? An imaginary number of broken radios hums and buzzes inside this impossible literary object. One radio may tune into a single frequency at a time, but a chorus of broken radios can broadcast everything from an infernal racket to the music of the spheres all at once. You don't tamper with Milton to be funny, our holy fool may attest. But for all its radical theology, Radios is, in the end, a divine musical comedy. Listen carefully, and you'll hear a marvelously cracked piece of postmodern music behind the curtain of Johnson's literary performance. At a party with his students one night, so the story goes, the poet first heard a recording of Baroque variations by the composer Lucas Foss. At one point in the work, a xylophone spells out Johannes Sebastian Bach in Morse code. Elsewhere, a highly trained percussionist smashes a bottle with a hammer. Johnson's various enthusiasms must have lined up quite nicely that evening, because he embarked upon the solitary quest in the cloud chamber that would become Radios the next day. In the dedicatory note to his book, Johnson quotes Foss's liner notes to Variation 1 on a Larghetto by Handel as a sort of key to his own work. Groups of instruments play the Larghetto, the Handel Larghetto, but keep submerging into inaudibility rather than pausing. Handel's notes are always present, but often inaudible. The inaudible moments leave holes in Handel's music. And this is one of the great parentheticals of all time. I composed the holes. The perforated Handel is played by different groups of the orchestra in 3 different keys at one point, in 4 different speeds at another. Handel's Larghetto may very well be the most beautiful melody the composer ever wrote. Let's listen to the always present but often inaudible music behind Foss's variation. I'll just play a minute. Now, here's the otherworldly beauty of Handel under eclipse. It's hard not to hear broken radios searching for a classical music broadcast in this perforated larghetto's eerie harmonics and bursts of sonority. If you find radios slow going, try reading it as the libretto for a post-structuralist space opera. Lyrics erased by Johnson, score perforated by Foss. Jumping ahead. It gets crazier, but I won't play more of it because we'll hear Larry play music later. The wonder of variations in music, in evolutionary biology, and beyond is how one variation begets another, though you never know what you'll beget. Perforating Paradise Lost, Johnson produced a literary variation on Foss's musical variation on a Baroque contemporary of Milton, Handel, whose own body of work includes dozens of variations in its own right. To see how radios makes possible even further variations on itself, let's turn to the page in Milton's poem where Satan's shield first appears. I won't read the whole passage, but that's the extended passage in the original page. What if somebody other than Johnson, say a young woman in rural New England on a snowy night long ago, were to compose her own holes in this dark material? You probably can't read that, it's too small. Time can thunder here in my unhappy mansion, but that voice of fire scarce ceased. The ethereal artist in her globe of marl steps on and on. It's hardly because I could not stop for death, but you get the idea. There are innumerable poems encrypted in the harmonious numbers of Paradise Lost. I even hear echoes of the sadly underrated poet, occasional film extra, and Ronald Johnson enthusiast, Srikanth Reddy, in this literary cloud chamber. The mind is a matter, my friends, of voice, the edge of it moving like glass in rivers, but burning. I could do this forever, and that's exactly the point. You could too. I suspect that's why Johnson breaks off his own work at Book 4 of Paradise Lost, leaving nearly 7,000 lines of pristine Meltonic pentameters for others to cross out someday. Radios kind of wrote itself, said the author of this incomplete erasure. I think it ended when it needed to end, and I didn't need to add the rest. An open-ended variation on Milton's song, Radios invites us to add the rest. And why stop at Paradise Lost, really? Compose your own holes in any book. Alice in Wonderland, the Constitution of the United States of America, the Rig Veda, and you'll unearth a manifold matrix of worlds within. A literary multiverse, Radios is riddled with cosmological wormholes, theological rabbit holes, and plain old typographical holes. From the O tree, rhyming with poetry, that opens the work, to the O for the apocalypse that trumpets the poem's closing revelations, Johnson makes us see the whole, H-O-L-E, in whole with a W, and he makes us hear the whole in holy. There's a hole in wonder, too, though I'd never tumbled down it until I came across the following page in Radios. A mind to be changed by place or lace, heaven of hell, astonished on the oblivious pool, the O of wonder, circumference hung on shoulders like the moon, whose optic glass at evening from the top new globe of some great burning azure vaulted. This is the scene of Satan's shield, right, in Milton. The first time I read this passage, I had no idea what lay behind it. But that floating little phrase, the O of wonder, kept looping around in my head. So I dug up an old copy of Paradise Lost to read the Miltonic original, and was wonderstruck. Over 3,000 years ago, a blind Greek poet pictured the world on an ancient shield. 2.5 millennia later, the moon, magnified by an optic glass, eclipsed Homer's world in a theological poem of Reformation England. In my own lifetime, I was 4. Astronauts had set foot on the moon's surface only a few years earlier. A little-known American poet erased Milton's spotty globe all the way down to a wondrous O. World, moon, O. The word for when things line up in this way is Syzygy. The microscopic linkage of chromosomes ready necessary for reproduction in our species is one example. An eclipse, when 3 celestial bodies line up in astronomical space, is another. The word syzygy is itself a syzygy, which almost makes me believe in intelligent design as far as language is concerned. Read aloud its sequence of 3 identical vowels lined up in a row. Why, why? And you'll hear humankind grappling with the mystery of causation. Let's not overlook that linked chain of O's in the O of wonder either. It's a syzygy too. Why? Oh. We all live that song. So many images flicker through this O in Radios. A full moon, a ghostly shield, a hole in a page from a time-worn edition of Paradise Lost. But I always return to a mouth open in wonder. When we see golden acrobats turning handsprings on an ancient shield, or when the mountains of the moon first swim into focus through a telescope's eyepiece, we say, oh, hardly aware that our lips are assuming the shape of the signifier itself. The O of wonder, Johnson shows us, is the O in wonder, in the word wonder. I can't think of any other word where our writing system and the morphology of speech enter into such wondrous alignment. But the mouth forms an O in arousal, and in hunger, and in death's terminal rictus too. Thy mouth was open, George Herbert says, to death personified, but thou couldst not sing. There's no such thing as pure or simple wonder. When Thamazine forces our lips into an O, all those ancient drives, from Eros to Thanatos, move through us as well. The art of poetry traditionally originates in this inexhaustible, sonorous O. O Muse, O Lord, O Love, O Globalization. The O that Johnson plucks out of wonder invokes this endless poetic variation. With all due respect to Plato and Aristotle, philosophy isn't the only vocation that can spring from Thamazine. if you look closely at the O of wonder, you'll see a poem beginning there, too. Thanks. We'll just leave it on this, huh? Cool. So I'm happy to answer questions, or if people have to go off to class, you're dismissed. I hope to see some of you at the reading this evening. But do we have time for questions or anything?
We have.
Or
I think we have at least 10 minutes.
okay. Yeah, John.
I don't have an interesting question, but I'm interested in why you kept bringing the poet's psyche into the story. I mean, there's got to be a payoff somewhere. But let me phrase it more academically.
Yeah.
I just wonder.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it's not a use of wonder, right? I mean.
Yeah, speculation.
That the difference between the world that Hephaestus creates and the fact that it's Hephaestus that creates it.
Right, that it's a god.
Yeah, right. So is it the world from the point of view of a god, or the world seen by a god, and what difference?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think
make?
Yeah. So not to foreclose your question, but I think there's an important distinction to be made, right? Because I'm kind of performing a kind of faux naive reading by saying that the god creates the shield. What's really happening is that a poet is creating a god who creates a shield, right? So I think that's an important distinction, right? So the shield and the god are the results of a poetic act of production. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in the days of Paul de Man, right? Then it would be a rhetorical performance that returns wonder to skepticism by virtue of the very labor that it generates. So I guess I would like to push you into that space. That relationship between irony and wonder, which is also the space that, in a way, that John's. By the way, I just want to say the reason why I'm asking the question is this was a marvelous talk, partially because it was totally surprising. I mean, you didn't do anything academic.
Oh well, thank you. Yeah, that's been
it's
that's
so
pleasure.
refreshing.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. So I think the one way of answering your question is to think about why is wonder figured on a shield in these kind of flashpoints in the history of the art, right? A shield is a piece of military technology, right? And I think that it has to, that there's a way that the made wonder, the humanly made wonder of the shield, right, is different from the kind of wonder of the world as, say, Heidegger imagines it, right? Because it's not something the world is not utterly not made, right? You have to, for Heidegger, the only true experience of wonder is wonder at the totality of the world. Right? You can't feel wonder at this bottle or anything like that. So the madeness of the shield is where the ironization of wonder happens, I think. And you're kind of helping me to see that I think that it occurs within a political, within the context of political conflict, right? The shield, protects its bearer, but it's also protects its bearer long enough to do harm on the battlefield, right? It's a defensive weapon, right? I think. So that kind of conflicted kind of ontology of a shield, or its use, its conflicted teleology, is related to the kind of strange ironization of wonder that happens at these moments in literary history. Milton does the same thing, right, with Satan. Satan's shield is, it's like not really a battlefield weapon, because Satan has lost the battle for heaven at the beginning of Paradise Lost, right? He continues war by other means. It's a political poem, really, and then it's a political conflict that Satan's engaged in, involving persuasion and deceit, and and so, I think that's just a way of starting to think about answering your question. Yeah, yeah, Lynn.
One of the things that interested me,
Yeah.
now that we're talking, is that the poet erases himself in, like, we are not conscious of Homer when we are reading, Homer.
Right, right.
Nor really conscious of Milton.
Yeah.
Although Milton is so Miltonic that it's hard not to know that it's Milton
sentences.
that's there.
Yeah.
But so the poet, in creating the god who creates the shield, for it to have its effect, the poet then has to erase him.
Yes, to withdraw from his creation.
Right,
yeah.
or else the wonder isn't there anymore.
Yeah.
It's just a fiction.
Yeah, and I think that's probably related to, like, that kind of self-cancellation, which is not ubiquitous in poetic, production, but in certain moments, in certain works. I think it has to do with, in these moments of wonder, with kind of the sublime, but kind of seen a little bit differently. We think, tradition of thinking about the sublime is that it, we feel dread before it because there's something about it that cancels out our subjectivity, right? But in wonder and in seeing the world in its totality, there's a different experience, right? It's like the astronauts when they view Earth from outer space and all these reports that they have. They're all like military personnel, but for a moment their identities are erased because they describe looking at the Earth in terms of its fragility and with a kind of tenderness toward it. So it's not like an encounter of the sublime. You'd think it would be seeing the totality of the planet, but it's actually it's the opposite of the sublime. It's not that you're canceled out by the giant waterfall or the giant mountain peak. It's that you realize how human subjectivity, as it's exploding all over the planet, can very easily destroy the sublime object, right? So I think that kind of that withdrawal of literary subjectivity in these moments has to do with that kind of odd place that the totality of worlds.
The other thing I was thinking about in terms of erasure, and this is like beyond the purview of your talk by far, but is the kind of destruction of if that shield had been made. That the kinds of destruction that is going on in the Middle East right now with the intentional destruction of
artifacts. Yes. Well, I think that the shield as a figure is really, it's something I actually need to think more about, and probably in working through this further. What work does a shield do protectively in the political theater? A shield made of language do within the political theater that we find ourselves in. I think, in Homer, shields most often that I know of depict like a monster, like a gorgon. And so the work, that apotropaic, work, turns men to stone, right? Achilles' shield turns men into philosophers, and that they're like equally ineffective on the battlefield as stone people, right? But it's a different strategy for thinking through the work of art and the political. Any other questions? Yeah.
Would the show perhaps represent a liminal space in which everything is encapsulated? Because on the image, it shows this political conflict and all of this. And then I was just thinking, like, in Wonder, there's also this kind of sense of like liminality where you're on the threshold of like this discovery. And so, I don't know, like, and even like with the O itself, just like there's this like gap.
Yeah.
And there's this hole in all of it, and so like that's just kind of what I'm relating to.
Yeah. You know, the Shield of Achilles actually has like they call it the ocean river in the classical world that circles creation. And you know, a lot of people have tried to. I'm just interested in your first comment about like what's on the edge of the shield as one imagines it, and you know, and it's very hard to visualize the shield, and this is why some efforts to recreate it, you know, in the material world fail again and again. And there have been many attempts, pictorial and sculptural, and in bronze and silver, and but there's a strange way in which it also feels like a completely hollow object, right? And I think, you know, in some ways, all of these literary cosmologies end up leaving one with the feeling that the world's very existence is in doubt. And then that's exactly why you feel it all the more powerfully, its presence. Yeah, Bob?
I was wondering if you would go to Auden's shield at any point, because he's the one who says
Yeah.
that it's the one place in the poem where the artist says to the soldier, stand aside.
Right.
This is my deal. So he gives wonder to the artist and pity to the soldier.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and in some ways that's kind of crude. You know, I don't really trust that kind of distribution of, you know, affective labor or feeling, you know, among these different roles. And, you know, I don't want to be like a cheerleader for wonder, you know, when I give this. I always feel like I'm kind of a little bit edging toward that. And I don't think, obviously lots of people have thought about the way that wonder's been implicated in, you know, political conquest and things like that. So in some ways, you know, the soldier has waged war under the aegis of wonder as well, historically on our planet. And you know, Dante would say that would claim pity as the province of the poet. So I don't know. I think that's probably why I've just shied away from talking about Auden here and more toward Johnson, because I think the way that wonder has worked out different ways of thinking about the totality of or a cosmology in the Homeric instance and in the Miltonic and then in the Johnson kind of Johnsonian kind of multiverse. That to me feels more like what I'm drawn to, I think. But I got to read the Auden again, probably. Great, well thank you guys.